Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that takes a close look at source materials to get you up to speed quickly and thoughtfully. This Deep Dive is brought to you by Reformed Thinking. Our focus today is on a really striking, you could almost say counterintuitive truth that we find right in the heart of the Abrahamic covenant narrative. We're looking at Genesis 15, specifically verses 12 through 16. And, the context is that Abram has just received this incredible declaration. He believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. So you'd expect this moment of assurance to feel like, well, a victory. But what he gets isn't immediate sunlight or a quick path to the promised land. What he receives is certainty, yes, but it's a certainty that's interpreted through darkness and terror and a decree of a 4-century delay that involves a lot of suffering. And that's really the paradox we want to get into. How does God confirm an absolutely settled promise, a promise of offspring and land, but at the same time, he decrees this long, hard season of affliction for the very people who are going to inherit that promise?
So our goal is to really extract what this passage teaches us about divine sovereignty, about God's justice, and maybe how we as followers of God today are supposed to understand suffering when we know that God's plan is already fixed and settled.
Right. And it's so important to set the scene. Genesis 15 is, you can't overstate it. It's the defining chapter for the covenant God makes with Abram. He's worried. He's worried about the future. He has no heir. And God gives him this word promising descendants as numerous as the stars. And Abram believes that faith is credited to him. But our sources really point out that even true faith can be weak. It can be vulnerable to doubt, especially when years and decades go by without seeing the fulfillment. So God condescends. He gives Abram assurance. But it's not just a warm feeling. He institutes this solemn, visible ritual, the cutting of the covenant. And this oracle, the specific words in verses 12 to 16, it's so critical because it gives the whole historical map for the covenant before the visible part, the fire, actually ratifies it. It explains the entire, rocky road that this promise has to travel.
Okay, let's unpack that initial scene then, because you're right. The atmosphere just shifts so violently in verse 12. 1 minute, Abram is being encouraged to look up and count the stars in this vast, hopeful night sky. And then as the sun goes down, he faces something completely different. He's overcome by a, quote, dreadful and great darkness. It's just an immediate, jarring reversal of feeling.
It is a shocking reversal. The divine encounter here starts not with comfort, but with terror. And the way Abram receives this prophecy is so deliberate. It's this deep sleep. The Hebrew word is tardama. This is not just him being tired after preparing the animals for the covenant. Not at all.
Right. This is a divinely imposed state.
Exactly. It's a state of total, divinely imposed stillness. And we see this word, pardama, in other really critical moments in Scripture. Think about Genesis 2:21.
About Adam.
With Adam, God puts Adam into this exact same deep sleep so that the creation of Eve is entirely God's work. It removes Adam from the picture completely. And it's the same thing here. Abram is rendered totally passive. He can't speak. He can't object. He can't help. He can't even, offer some kind of contribution to the right.
So that passivity, it seems like that's the whole theological point of the scene.
Yeah.
What is that deep sleep communicating about the covenant itself?
It communicates that the certainty of this promise rests entirely, and I mean strictly, on God's initiative. If Abram were awake, there'd be this implication that his attention or his moral state or even his physical stamina might somehow contribute to the covenant being sure. But because he's incapacitated, God alone is revealed as the one who acts. The certainty is rooted only in God's faithfulness, in his unchangeable character, and our sources really line this up with the covenant of grace itself. It has this monergistic nature. God alone guarantees the terms, God alone walks between the pieces and executes the terms, and Abram receives the benefit passively through the gift of faith. This isn't a team effort, it's a divine oath.
So even before the sign of the smoking fire pot passes between the pieces, the Lord is administering this really potent theological lesson through Abram's senses. And that lesson is just dominated by fear. And this is where the language is so intense. The text just stacks these Hebrew terms on top of each other.
It does. The atmosphere is clearly designed to crush any human pride. The text piles up ima, which is terror, this trembling kind of fear. It joins that with jochla, meaning great or immense. And then finally, dejo, which is just deep darkness, this cumulative effect. It pushes the experience way beyond just mild unease. This is a crushing, holy fear. It's an overwhelming, visceral encounter with the reality that the living sovereign God is drawing near.
I think this is a point where a lot of us modern listeners need a bit of a correction. We often think that God's nearness, it should feel comfortable or manageable or instantly uplifting. Genesis 15:12 just completely refutes that.
It does precisely. When the Holy One unveils himself in this kind of covenant revelation, especially one that involves judging nations and decreeing centuries of suffering, the creature's proper response is reverent trembling. This fear isn't the opposite of faith. In a way, it's the proper posture of faith before divine majesty. Faith is trusting the God who is holy enough to inspire this kind of terror.
So the terror itself is part of the message.
Absolutely. Think about the prophetic context. When God reveals the future, he often does so in these scenes of awesome power. This darkness and terror, they mark the scene as uniquely revelatory. It signals that Abram is being brought into a disclosure that concerns centuries of history, not just his immediate problem of not having a son.
And the darkness isn't just a psychological reaction in Abram, is it? It's deeply symbolic. It seems to foreshadow the actual content of the oracle that's about to come in verse 13.
Yes, the darkness is interpretive. It's a preview of the road ahead. The covenant will be fulfilled, but the path to that fulfillment runs through the night, not through uninterrupted ease. It tells the reader in advance that the promise will move through a period of darkness, through a period of national affliction.
Which sets the framework for how we should think about suffering in God's plan from this point on.
Exactly. Suffering in this framework isn't a sign that God's promise has failed or that he's absent. It is an appointed phase in his wise and purposeful providence. The darkness on the covenant floor is a mirror of the darkness awaiting the covenant people.
And if you link that back to the visible rock, Abram's already cut these animals in half.
Yeah.
And the severed pieces are just lying there. The darkness perfectly fits the gravity of what is happening. God is about to bind himself by a life and death oath. The mood fits the event.
The whole structure reinforces the message. God could have just spoken the words in the morning light.
Sure.
But he chose this. The deepest sleep, the darkest hour, the greatest dread. It's a pedagogical choice. It ensures that Abram, and by extension all of us reading it, understand that this certainty is written in serious, irreversible terms. The Bible's broader patterns confirm this. Darkness often accompanies divine judgment, like the plague in Egypt, and also divine self-disclosure, like at Mount Sinai. The dread is intentional.
Okay, so we transition from that atmosphere of holy dread to the staggering content of the oracle itself in verse 13. God begins this prophecy with a formula of certainty, making sure Abram knows this is absolutely fixed. He says, "know for certain." That doubled Hebrew verb, yechetoda, it just presses assurance and factual knowledge deep into Abram's mind. This isn't some, possible future scenario. It's a sovereign decree of history. This is God describing what he has already decided will happen.
And yet the content of that absolute certainty is just utterly sobering. Abram's offspring, his Zarkak, they aren't going to immediately inherit the land in peace. Instead, they'll be sojourners in a land that is not their own. They'll be made to serve, and they will be afflicted. That promise of land doesn't mean the wandering is over. They're going to be strangers, jujur, without property rights, vulnerable.
And the affliction is very specific. Servitude and suffering. And then God assigns a duration to it. 400 years.
Yes, 400 years. This part is so critical. God isn't just reacting to some future malice from the Egyptians. He set the clock centuries before they even became a threat.
This precise, fixed timeline is where our sources draw a really sharp theological line in the sand. This decree, established before the oppressors even existed, it just immediately settles the question of God's relationship to time and history.
It explicitly refutes certain theological errors. For example, the idea that God learns or reacts to human choices in real time, something like open theism.
Right.
If God were just reacting to human free will, he could never guarantee a precise 400-year duration of affliction. He couldn't. Nor could he guarantee the exact moment the Amorites' iniquity would be full, which we'll get to later. By anchoring this prophecy in the certainty of his own exhaustive knowledge and his decree, God is demonstrating that the suffering of his people is a necessary chapter in his redemptive plan, and it's governed entirely by his will. The time is fixed by God's decree. History isn't arbitrary, it's providentially controlled.
Okay, but if we accept that premise, that God has complete sovereignty here and he ordains the affliction, it brings up the most challenging question of all. Why? Why decree 4 centuries of oppression? Why would a faithful God set up his people for that?
It's the right question to ask, and it leads us to this concept of a severe mercy. The affliction isn't ultimately punitive toward Israel in this context. It's actually constructive. Think about it. When Jacob's family entered Egypt, they numbered only 70 people. If they had stayed in Canaan for those hundreds of years, the risk of assimilation would have been, close to 100%.
They would have just blended in and disappeared.
Completely. Canaanite culture was right there. It was religiously seductive, geographically close, intermarriage, cultural exchange. It would have dissolved the holy seed. The Abrahamic covenant line would have become indistinguishable from the surrounding pagan nations. The promise to preserve a people for himself would have failed.
So Egypt functions almost like a protective barrier, preventing that dilution of the covenant line. Can you unpack the sort of sociological mechanics of how Egypt did that?
We can, actually. Egypt served as a segregated incubator for a couple of specific reasons. First, they had a very rigid social stratification that was hostile to foreigners. And maybe most importantly, the specific work assigned to the Israelites shepherding was, as Genesis 46 tells us, an abomination to the Egyptians.
So their very job made them outsiders.
Exactly. This cultural loathing was instrumental.
Hmm.
It ensured the Israelites were physically isolated in the land of Goshen. It prevented the very intermingling and religious assimilation that would have absolutely happened in Canaan. So this iron furnace, as Deuteronomy 4 later calls it, it forged a distinct massive nation out of a small family. It preserved the holy seed for the eventual land inheritance. The affliction was actually essential to creating a people separate from the world, ready to receive God's law and inherit his land.
That really does reframe the whole concept of that national suffering. It was a tool of distinction, a tool of preservation, necessary for the promise to survive its own formative centuries. And there's also a real pastoral comfort in the duration being so precisely fixed. The Israelites were not in Egypt one day longer than God had decreed. The time was set before the first whip ever cracked.
That is an immense comfort for us today. When we face our own personal trials, we often feel like they're endless or that they're meaningless. But this text assures us that even the darkest and longest trials have boundaries that are set by God's good purpose. The 400 years could not hold Israel permanently. God controls the duration of our difficulties. He ensures they last only as long as is necessary to achieve his preset good purposes for us. The suffering is measured, the expiration date is fixed, and that certainty allows us to endure the wait.
Then the oracle pivots, and it pivots decisively in verse 14. God introduces this crucial conjunction, but I will also judge the nation whom they will serve. So the decree of affliction is not the final word, and the nation doing the afflicting will not get away with it. This verse is just so characterized by God's active intervention. The whole sentence turns on that divine eye. God isn't just predicting a judgment. He declares that he will personally execute it. This is covenant faithfulness enacted in history. It's the backbone of the entire Exodus narrative, God moving in to settle the accounts.
That's right. The declaration is Dan, combined with the emphatic pronoun Anoki, I myself will judge. The oppressor might feel powerful for 400 years, but God makes it crystal clear that their time is rented and their actions are being recorded. This detail is so critical because it reassures the faithful that, despite the visible imbalance of power here on earth, earthly rulers do not get the final say. They will be summoned before the judge of all the earth.
But this leads us to that critical theological tension that, well, Reformed thought really holds on to. If God ordains the duration of the slavery, how can he then hold the slave masters accountable for their cruelty? Doesn't that make God the author of their sin?
That is the ultimate difficulty of sovereignty and human responsibility, and we have to hold it in tension. We have to assert that God ordains the event, the 400 years of servitude, to achieve his redemptive purpose. But the wickedness, the malice with which the Egyptians executed that servitude, Exodus 1.10, where they actively sought to destroy Israel through infanticide, that proceeded entirely from their own sinful hearts.
So God uses the action, but not the sinful motive behind it.
Exactly. This aligns perfectly with the Westminster Confession in v.4. God's decree covers all things, yet the sinfulness of wicked acts proceeds only from the creature, not from God. The Egyptians were acting out of their own free wicked malice, and for that, God summons them to his tribunal. He uses their wicked intentions for his good plan, but he does not endorse or participate in the wickedness itself. Their moral guilt remains full and undiminished.
So the distinction is between the divine blueprint for history and the creature's moral culpability within that blueprint. The oppressor fulfills God's timeline, but they do it with unforgivable sin in their hearts. And the outcome of this judgment is just astonishing. The final clause promises, and afterward these shall come out with great possessions. This is not a throwaway detail. This is the ultimate public display of covenant vindication of divine restitution.
Yeah, the Hebrew term rekshash gadol signifies substantial wealth. It's movable property way beyond just, survival gear for a trip through the desert.
It's a statement.
It is a public material reversal of 4 centuries of national shame and economic depletion. God doesn't rescue his people secretly or with empty hands. They leave as an economic and political force. And this promise, of course, finds its literal fulfillment in the final hours of the
In
Exodus.
Exodus 12.
Exactly. In Exodus 12, verses 35 and 36, we read that Israel explicitly asked for and plundered the Egyptians. And this wasn't viewed by God as simple theft, it was divine restitution.
It was back wages.
It was back wages for 4 centuries of unpaid, forced labor, mandated and enforced by the supreme judge. The Egyptians were financially stripped of their resources and forced to compensate the very nation they had tried to wipe out.
There's also this remarkable richness in the ultimate purpose of that wealth. It wasn't just to, set them up economically in the wilderness. The oppressor was, without knowing it, funding the worship of the very God they denied.
The irony is incredible, isn't it? The gold, the silver, the fine linens that Israel carried out of Egypt, the spoils of the enemy, were the precise materials that were later used to construct the tabernacle in the wilderness.
Wow.
The massive, beautiful dwelling place for God's presence, the holy center of Israel's worship, was built using the involuntary contributions of their former oppressors. The enemy's evil schemes end up accumulating the resources for God's glory and his people's redemption.
In this pattern, this descent into servitude and darkness before the ascent to glory, and then taking the spoils of the enemy, it has these immediate echoes. It points forward to the very shape of the gospel.
Absolutely. The entire experience has these strong Christological contours. Christ, the true son of Abraham, he entered the world not into ease, but into the darkness of the form of a servant, as Philippians 2 says. He endured the ultimate servitude on the cross. He entered the deepest sleep and the greatest darkness to break the power of the oppressor Satan, sin, and death.
And just as Israel came out of Egypt victorious,
Christ came out victorious through resurrection, and the church, the new Israel, we receive the great possessions from this victory. Ephesians 4 talks about Christ ascending and leading captivity captive, giving gifts to men. Our justification, our sanctification, the graces of the Spirit, our eternal inheritance, these are the spoils of Christ's victory, stripped from the grip of our former master, the devil.
So just as Israel marched out, adorned with the jewels of Egypt, the believer marches toward glory, adorned with the righteousness of Christ and the spiritual riches that were secured by his obedience. The pattern confirms that our darkest seasons are just the necessary prelude to a glorious, you could say a materially enriched exodus. Okay, so having covered these centuries of national affliction and the promised reversal, the oracle takes this dramatically personal and, tender turn in verse 15. God shifts the focus from the descendants' trials right back to Abram himself. He says, "As for you." And this feels like a deliberate act of pastoral care. God has just delivered this heavy national prophecy that Abram can't possibly manage or prevent. But he doesn't just leave his servant crushed underneath that weight. He gives him a promise of personal peace, shalom, right in the midst of this coming turbulence for his people.
It's a beautiful moment. The promise is that Abram will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. This is covenantal language. It speaks of continuity, of settled favor. It assures Abram that he'll be gathered into God's ongoing purposes and he'll join his family line in the place of the blessed dead.
And that word peace is key.
It is. It signifies wholeness, completeness, a settledness with God. It affirms that Abram dies not under divine wrath or a covenant curse, but in divine favor. The terror and the dread of verse 12 are balanced by this personal anchor of peace in verse 15. The Lord who governs centuries is also the shepherd of one man.
This section powerfully shapes what the proper posture of faith should be. Abram is taught to trust promises whose fullest expression lies far, far beyond his own earthly lifespan. He won't see the Exodus, he won't see the conquest, but he dies in favor.
And that is the definition of true faith, isn't it? It's reflected so well in Hebrews 11. The patriarchs died in faith, not having received the things promised. Faith rests in God's certainty. It doesn't demand God's speed. The Lord doesn't give Abram a schedule that he can master or control. He gives him peace, a peace that allows him to live and die with settledness, just trusting the overarching plan.
But then in the very next verse, verse 16, it provides the definitive answer as to why the delay is necessary. It connects the timetable directly to God's moral governance. They will return in the 4th generation, but the reason is purely moral. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. This feels like the linchpin of the whole timetable. God isn't just acting arbitrarily with his time. He's waiting for a precise, judicial moment that involves the moral state of another nation.
This is the moral center of the entire oracle. The Amorites here, they represent the collective peoples of Canaan whom Israel will eventually displace. The word alon for iniquity, it signifies this guilt-laden wickedness, a moral crookedness that makes a people liable to divine judgment. And the term shalom, complete, means that the cup of their rebellion has to fill up to a certain measure, a quota, before judgment can justly fall.
So God views sin cumulatively.
And judicially. This is why the conquest of Canaan was delayed for centuries. It wasn't arbitrary, it was a judicial execution, and it was delivered only after divine patience had fully expired. It totally reframes the later conquest narrative. It assures us that what happens in Joshua is the outworking of God's settled justice after centuries of forbearance.
This forces us to understand that God is truly slow to anger. His restraint is real mercy, but it is not moral neutrality. He is literally counting the acts of wickedness until that measure is full.
Precisely. God is meticulous in his justice. He waits until the guilt ripens. And this principle is reinforced later in the law. Leviticus 18 and Deuteronomy 9 insist that Israel inherits the land not because they are so righteous, but because of God's oath and the accumulated wickedness of the nations living there.
So God's restraint isn't weakness.
Not at all. He refuses to execute final judgment prematurely. He acts only when the moral threshold that he has set has been reached. And this concept of the iniquity being complete, it serves as a sober warning for every generation, including ours. To persist in sin under the sunlight of God's restraint isn't to escape wrath, it's to store it up. Divine patience is given for repentance, but if it's abused, it leads to certain judgment when the measure is full.
Let's just pause for a second and address the numbers, because our sources highlight this flexible chronology. You have the 400 years of affliction, but then later in Exodus it's cited as 430 years, and here it says the return is in the 4th generation. How do we reconcile those without getting bogged down?
It's a good question, and we have to recognize that Scripture often uses rounded, or you might say covenantal figures for rhetorical and prophetic effect. It's not always adhering to the rigid, minute-by-minute precision of a modern calendar. The 400 years functions like a prophetic headline. It's an emphatic, memorable span that signifies a long, complete era of suffering.
Okay.
The 430 years that's cited in Exodus, that likely begins counting from a slightly earlier date, perhaps from the actual confirmation of the covenant with Abram, or maybe from the time Jacob's family entered Egypt. The main point is that God sets the times. The specifics are there to confirm that the night will be long, but it will not be endless.
And the 4th generation fits into that same interpretive flexibility.
It does. It's a covenantal way of speaking about a very long period. It's
Good.
likely reflecting several hundred years and the era of these long patriarchal lifespans, or maybe even clan eras, rather than what we would think of as a fixed demographic unit of 70 or 80 years.
So the timeline is really given to fortify trust, not to invite skepticism about the math.
Exactly. The world will try to turn God's word into a puzzle, to avoid God's absolute claim over time, but the text's purpose is singular. To confirm that the night is scheduled, it is purposeful, and it is strictly temporary. The covenant is coming through precisely on God's time.
So Genesis 15.1-16 doesn't just stand as a historical anecdote. Our sources describe it as the canonical roadmap for understanding the entire Pentateuch.
It really dictates the entire framework for the next phase of redemptive history. It places the Exodus narrative squarely inside the Abrahamic covenant before Israel even exists as a nation. So when the book of Exodus opens with the exact words servitude and affliction, the reader is supposed to know they are now witnessing covenant faithfulness in motion.
This was all foretold.
All of it.
Yeah.
When Moses arrives, and later when God remembers his covenant in Exodus 2, he's not just reacting to a crisis, he is moving toward the promised afterward from Genesis 15. The plagues are the specific judicial execution of the declaration, I will judge that nation. The Exodus is not a surprise rescue or political luck. It's a meticulously planned covenantal fulfillment.
And the vindication of the people is literally written in the materials they carry out. That detail about great possessions is fulfilled when Israel departs with all that silver, gold, and clothing. This public reversal is a theological sign that the oppressor never gets to keep the fruits of their oppression. The redeemed leave publicly honored and provided for by the Lord's own hand.
And that vindication then transitions directly into the moral meaning of the conquest narrative. Genesis 15.16 provides the moral framework that lies beneath the entry into Canaan. Joshua's entry is the fulfillment of the promised return, but it's executed only when that moral threshold set in verse 16, the Amorites' iniquity being complete, had finally been reached.
which is why it's so important to tie this forward to the law itself.
It is. Texts like Deuteronomy 9 clarify that Israel inherits the land because the land, due to the wickedness of its inhabitants, must vomit them out. This prevents Israel from boasting of their own righteousness, and it ensures they understand that the conquest is a judicial action after divine patience, not merely an ethnic cleansing.
And this massive sweep of sovereignty, affliction, and vindication, it even echoes into the New Testament. I'm thinking of Stephen's final speech in Acts 7, which is just this brilliant synthesis of this whole history.
It is. Stephen intentionally picks up this Genesis 15 pattern, the theme of the sojourner, the enslaved nation, the 400 years, to demonstrate that God's sovereign plan has been unfolding precisely as foretold throughout Israel's entire history. He does this even as he's pointing out how his people misunderstood or resisted his messengers. It shows that God governs history using these periods of darkness and delay to achieve his greater redemptive work.
Okay, let's try to gather the theological harvest now. Let's synthesize the four central doctrines that our sources draw from this passage, just for the benefit of the listener trying to put it all together.
Sure, the first would be the absolute divine providence. God's exhaustive rule covers everything. Affliction is not chaos. It is not outside his control. He foreknows, he foretells, and he governs the suffering of his people, fixing its duration and directing its purpose. Even the darkness itself is subject to his rule.
Second would be covenant certainty with delay. The promise of salvation, of inheritance, is absolutely sure. It's guaranteed by God's own oath. But we must trust the timetable that God appoints. The long oppression proves that a delay is not a denial. It's an appointment set by God's wisdom, and it trains our faith to rest in his word rather than in what we can immediately see.
Third is justice joined to patience. God judges wickedness with this holy restraint, waiting until guilt reaches its fullness, which we see with the Amorites. God's justice is precise, it's measured, it's never arbitrary, and his patience is real mercy, but it is never moral indifference to evil.
And fourth, and this is maybe the most personal lesson, is pastoral care within sovereignty. God governs centuries and empires in these fixed timelines, but he shepherds a single believer personally. Verse 15 confirms this. God promises Abram peace at his personal end, even when his descendants are facing war and slavery. Biblical comfort is God's faithful word spoken directly into our hardest truths.
Right, and I think the overarching message is one of covenant realism. The promise travels through darkness, it travels through affliction and terror, but it does so under the hand of a holy, faithful, and tender Lord who has accounted for every single minute of the delay and every single action of the oppressor. This passage really requires a specific kind of faith, a covenant realism without despair. You, listening, you may be in a season of personal affliction, a kind of necessary 400 years, where the promise of resolution feels distant and vague, but remember the key lessons of Genesis 15. The affliction is measured, the oppressor is morally accountable, the redemption is certain, and the outcome will always magnify the covenant-keeping God. Trust the certainty of the promise. Do not despair over the speed of the fulfillment.
That distinction, trusting the certainty over demanding the speed, that really is everything. The Lord tells Abram that the path to his inheritance involves suffering, but he also guarantees Abram peace at his personal end. So here's something to think about. What does it mean for your life today that God provides peace, not through giving you control over the timeline, but through the absolute sworn certainty of his relationship with you, regardless of the darkness that might be surrounding you? Thank you for joining the Deep Dive. We hope this deep dive fortifies your faith and sharpens your understanding of God's sovereign rule over time, darkness, and destiny.